The history of monarchy in Canada stretches from pre-colonial times through to the present day. Canada's monarchical status began with the French settlement of the colony of Canada in the name of King Francis I in 1534, although a previous claim was made by England in the name of King Henry VII in 1497 when John Cabot made landfall in what is thought to be modern-day Newfoundland or Nova Scotia. Through both these lineages, the present Canadian monarchy can trace itself back to the Anglo-Saxon period and ultimately to the kings of the Angles and the early Scottish kings. Kings and queens reigning over Canada have included the monarchs of France, those of the United Kingdom, and those of Canada. Canadian historian Father Jacques Monnet said of Canada's crown, one of an approximate half-dozen that have survived through uninterrupted inheritance from beginnings that are older than our Canadian institution itself. Canada's first European monarchs instigated, funded, and supported the exploration and settlement of the country, while also implementing treaties between themselves and the various Aboriginal peoples encountered throughout the 18th century. Via Warren treaties, the Canadian colonies of France were ceded to King George III. The colonies were confederated by Queen Victoria in 1867 to form the Dominion of Canada. Canada later became a fully independent country through the Constitution Act of 1982 proclaimed by Elizabeth II, the Queen of Canada. Pre-colonial. While no indigenous North Americans in what is now Canada had what would be seen today as an official monarchy, some Aboriginal peoples, before the first encounters with French and British colonizers, were governmentally organized in a fashion similar to the Occidental idea of monarchy. Europeans often considered vast territories belonging to different Aboriginal groups to be kingdoms, such as the Kingdom of Saguenay, along the north shore of the St. Lawrence River between the Trinity River and the Isle aux Coudres, and the neighboring Kingdom of Canada, which stretched west to the island of Montreal, and the leaders of these communities were referred to as kings, particularly those chosen through heredity. Many had chieftains, whose powers varied from one nation to the next. In some examples, the chief would exercise considerable authority and influence on the decisions of the group, while in others he was more of a symbolic or ceremonial figure. In the latter cases, considering that many First Nations societies were governed by unwritten customs and codes of conduct, wherein the chieftain was bound to follow the advice of a council of elders, the form of government would have closely resembled a modern constitutional monarchy. Kingdoms and colonies. The first French colonies in North America were established in the name of King Henry IV at Acadia 3 years into the 17th century, the second being named Port Royal in his honor, and, by 1610, the first British settlements were established on Newfoundland, which had earlier been claimed in 1583 for Queen Elizabeth I. The following year, Henry Hudson embarked on the first trading voyage that led to the formation of the Hudson's Bay Company by royal charter from King Charles II. The king claimed an area that covered what is now Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Minnesota, North Dakota, and more, and called the area Rupert's Land after Prince Rupert, who helped to form the HBC. The French monarch also moved quickly, and it was in 1602 that Aymar de Chaste was appointed as Viceroy of Canada to represent King Henry IV. In 1615, Quebec City was, on the recommendation of Samuel de Champlain, made a royal capital of the French Empire in the Americas, with Champlain, who had been representative of, or lieutenant governor to, most viceroys of Canada, installed as the first viceregal representative of the king in New France. Some 60 years later, New France was designated as a royal province of France itself, ruled by the king through his appointed Conseil Souverain, which included the Governor-General as the monarch's stand-in. One of the king's decrees, intended to augment, as well as level the gender imbalance of the population of New France in the 1660s, was to send between 700 and 900 women, known as the filles du roi, to the province, each with douaire, new clothing, and paid passage to the New World. As the population increased, infrastructure was built, such as the chemin du roi between Montreal and Quebec City, and the Notre Dame de Quebec Cathedral, in the welfare of which the king took great interest. This type of French royal patronage extended through the 18th century, for example, from 1713 until 1758. Isle Royal, and especially Louisbourg, was a project of Kings Louis XIV and XV. Much of the financing for infrastructure, some 20 million livres, being provided by the monarchs. As Europeans moved inland, they encountered the Aboriginal peoples. Relations with them were originally considered to be between European and North American monarchs, though, for the French, that later changed to be one between sovereign and subject, and for the British, between European and Aboriginal nations under one king, leading to the incorporation of treaties with the Crown into the political culture of Canada, while the Aboriginal chiefs did aid the monarchs with the North American conflicts. Affairs in Europe would also affect the dealings of the New World, and eventually almost all of the French king's possessions in what was known as Canada were transferred from him to the British Crown, providing Canada with one singular monarchy. But this placement of French people under a British sovereign did not come without friction. During the escalation of hostilities in the lead-up to the 7 Years' War, the descendants of French colonialists in Acadia were asked by British officials, uneasy about where the Acadians' loyalties lay, to reaffirm their allegiance to King George III. The Acadians refused, and were subsequently deported from the area in what became known as the Great Upheaval. Following the Treaty of Paris, which concluded the 7 Years' War in 1763, a royal proclamation was issued by George III, laying out his policy regarding the newly acquired colonies in North America. This was regarded by American colonists as one of the intolerable acts that together eventually led to the outbreak of the American Revolution. This conflict led some 46,000 people loyal to the Crown, dubbed United Empire Loyalists, to flee north from the United States. The King in Council granted each family 200 acres of land. At the same time, thousands of Iroquois and other Aboriginals were expelled from New York and other states, resettling under the protection of the Crown in what is now Ontario, and some 3,000 former slaves of African ancestry, known as Black Loyalists, settled in Nova Scotia. Continuing today, Ontario residents descended from these original refugees retain the postnominals UE, standing for United Empire. The Loyalists who settled in Nova Scotia, however, were not immediately made to feel comfortable, as many of the already settled residents were aligned with the United States and its Republican cause. Colonel Thomas Dundas wrote from St. John, in 1786, have experienced every possible injury from the old inhabitants of Nova Scotia, who are even more disaffected towards the British government than any of the new states ever were. This makes me much doubt the remaining long dependent. Prince William arrived in Canada in July 1786, when he stated of the country, and more specifically, St. John's, truly deplorable, a most dreadful, inhospitable and barren country, though he later changed his opinion after meeting the local women, commenting on Canada's inexhaustible supply of women of the most obliging kind. Quote, he also became, in 1787, the first member of the royal family to visit Quebec. 4 years later, the prince's brother, Prince Edward, served from 1791 until the turn of the century in Canada on military duties and as commander of British North American troops. It is speculated that during that time he fathered 2 children by his Canadian mistress, Julie Destreet. Laurent, the prince lived at Quebec City, where he oversaw the establishment of the Holy Trinity Anglican Cathedral, a project of personal interest to his father, the king. In 1792, when the first elections for the Legislative Assembly of Lower Canada took place, a riot, fueled by ethnic character, broke out at one of the polls. Prince Edward was said to have climbed up to where he could be heard and addressed the crowd, stating, "Part then in peace. I urge you to unanimity and accord. Let me hear no more of the odious distinctions of English and French. You are all His Britannic Majesty's beloved Canadian subjects." Quote, it was reportedly the first time the word Canadian, which had previously been reserved only for francophones, was used in a manner that included all colonialists. Almost 20 years later, Prince Edward's only legitimate daughter, Victoria, was born on the 24th of May 1819 at Kensington Palace. However, Edward died shortly thereafter, leaving Victoria as heir to the throne until, upon the death of William IV, she ascended as queen at the age of 18. Though she would never visit Canada, she received numerous Canadians in audience and her image, thanks to the spread of newspapers and the invention of photography, was reproduced sufficiently to maintain popularity and loyalty in her colonies. Insurrections against the crown did still take place, though, notably the rebellions of 1837, which had been stirred up by the rise in power and influence of the United States and Republican sentiment. Most colonists, though, did not espouse a break with the crown, and, in the wake of the disturbances, the Queen called on her people in Upper Canada to eschew vengeance on the perpetrators in favour of justice. Further, the British Parliament granted responsible government to the Canadas, with the support of Victoria herself. Despite its decrease of the political influence in the colonies of both she and her representatives, where royal influence was lessened, though, it increased in other areas. Canadians celebrated momentous moments in the Queen's life, such as her marriage to Prince Albert. Royal events were inaugurated, such as the Queen's Plate, created with Queen Victoria's blessing in 1860, and, while she was monarch, Victoria's children and her children would come to Canada as either the Governor-General or Viceregal Consort, or to tour the country, Confederation and the Dominion. Prior to the Confederation of Canada, in which Queen Victoria took personal interest, a number of issues were of prime concern in the deliberations on the amalgamation of the 4 Canadian provinces into a country, most notably, the threat of invasion by the United States. It was the explicit intention of the Fathers of Confederation to unite the disparate British entities in North America into a single state under a constitutional monarchy, lamenting that form of government as a balance between the autocracy of the Russian Empire and the popular sovereignty of the United States, the latter having just led to the American Civil War, which was seen as the final stage in the discredit of democracy and republicanism. The Canadian Crown, the Fathers thought, would ensure diversity and racial harmony in Canada, thereby strengthening its legal and cultural sovereignty, especially considering the presence of the United States and its policy of manifest destiny. At the 1864 Charlottetown Conference, the delegates agreed unanimously that the new federation should be a constitutional monarchy. By the mid-1860s, neither the name nor the location of the capital of the hypothetical new union had been settled. On the former issue, various suggestions were put forward, including including Victorialand, in honor of the Queen, but John A. Macdonald, and then Governor-General of the Province of Canada, the Viscount Monk, supported the name Kingdom of Canada to fix the monarchical basis of the Constitution. The proposal, however, caused worries in the Foreign and Colonial Office in London that such a title would provoke the Republican United States, and a compromise term, Dominion, was adopted instead. Which city would serve as the capital of this Dominion was left by the British North America Act 1867, the Act of Parliament confederating Canada on the 1st of July of that year, to be decided by Queen Victoria, who has since been dubbed the Mother of Confederation. From a list that included various well-established cities in Upper and Lower Canada, Victoria chose the small community of B-Town on the grounds that it was defensible, located on a major waterway, and sat on the border between the two largest provinces of Canada, Quebec and Ontario. The new constitution vested in the Queen responsibility for peace, or order, and good government, as D'Arcy McGee had desired. In practice, though, the Second Reform Act 1867 and the emergence of a two-party system decreased Victoria's personal room for manoeuvre. Still, the ceremonial role for the monarchy remained unaltered, and the first visit of a member of the royal family to the Dominion of Canada took place 2 years after its creation. The sovereign's second son, Prince Arthur, arrived for training with the Rifle Brigade based at Montreal, of the Prince. The Lady Lisgar, wife of Governor-General the Lord Lisgar, noted in a letter to Victoria that Canadians seemed hopeful Prince Arthur would one day return as Governor-General himself. In the same year, Rupert's Land was ceded to the Crown in right of Canada from the Hudson's Bay Company, pulling it into the jurisdiction of the Northwest Territories. This move sparked AMEQTI's rebellion and the establishment by Louis Riel of a provisional Republican government in the Red River Valley. Following negotiations with Riel's government, the province of Manitoba was established in 1870 by the granting of royal assent to the Manitoba Act by Governor-General the Earl of Dufferin, as successor to Dufferin. Rather than sending Arthur to Canada as her representative, Queen Victoria, on the advice of her British Privy Council, instead appointed her son-in-law, the Marquess of Lorne, in 1878. This meant that, for the first time, Rideau Hall would have a permanent royal resident, Victoria's fourth daughter, Princess Louise. When the news reached Canada that a daughter of the Queen would be viceregal consort of Canada, a thrill of joy burst upon the Dominion. It was felt the princess would be a strong link between Canadians and the sovereign. However, the couple were initially not received well by the Canadian press, which complained about the imposition of royalty on the country's hitherto unregal society, which was only exasperated by mishaps and misunderstandings, and the resulting negative press horrified the princess. Louise endeared herself by making clear she had no pretenses, and eventually the worries of a rigid court at the Queen's Canadian residence turned out to be unfounded. The royal couple were found to be more relaxed than the predecessors, as demonstrated at the many ice skating and tobogganing parties, balls, dinners, and other state occasions hosted by the Marquess and Marchioness. The pair also made extensive tours of the country. The 3-month visit to British Columbia in 1882 did much to reconcile the local inhabitants to Confederation. The princess proved so popular that when the Governor-General announced that the awaited completion of the Transcontinental Railway would pass through Kicking Horse Pass into what has since become Vancouver, rather than by the Yellowhead Pass to Butte Inlet, Premier Robert Bevan asked the Duke whether it would be possible for Vancouver Island to become a separate kingdom with Princess Louise as Queen. The royal couple made a number of lasting contributions to Canadian society, especially in the realm of the arts and sciences, including including the establishment of the Royal Society of Canada, the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts, and the National Gallery of Canada. Louise was proficient in watercolor and oil painting, hanging many of her own works around Rideau Hall and painting sprigs of apple blossoms on doors along the palace's monk wing corridor, as well as overseeing the creation of the statue of Queen Victoria that stands on McGill University campus. Various locations were named for her, including Alberta, and a princess herself gave the name Regina to the capital of Saskatchewan. In all, Louise made such an impression on Canadian life that at her funeral on the 12th of December 1939, her coffin was borne by her own Canadian regiment, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders of Canada. In Queen Victoria's latter years, both her Golden and Diamond Jubilees, held in 1887 and 1897 to celebrate the 50th and 60th anniversaries, respectively, of the Queen's accession, were marked with great displays and public ceremonies in Canada, as well as colonial conferences held in the United Kingdom and attended by the Prime Ministers of the Dominions. For the Diamond Jubilee in Britain, Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier was invited and Canadian troops partook in Victoria's procession on the day of celebration, the 22nd of June. In Canada, a series of commemorative stamps, the first ever produced by the country, was issued on the 19th of June, and streets were decorated in cities and towns to mark Accession Day and the 22nd of June public holiday, on which fates brought Canadians of different ethnicities together. On that day, the Queen sent a telegram to all the Dominions, the message arriving in Canada 5 minutes after being sent from Buckingham Palace. In between the Jubilees, in December 1894, Prime Minister John Thomson died at Windsor Castle when to be admitted by the Queen to the Imperial Privy Council, being struck with a heart attack mere hours after the ceremony. Victoria, then aged and using a wheelchair, was wheeled into St. George's Chapel, where Thomson lay in state, and placed a wreath on her former Prime Minister's coffin. This moment was captured in a painting by Frederick Bell Smith, but the canvas was destroyed in the burning of the centre block in 1916. Victoria herself died at Osborne House on the 22nd of January 1901. After a reign lasting almost 64 years, the longest in British and Canadian history, and was succeeded by her eldest son, King Edward VII, Canada mourned the loss of Victoria and the Earl of Minto, then Governor-General, and Wilfrid Laurier were at odds over which church in Ottawa should host the official memorial service for the late Queen. Minto favoured the Church of England Cathedral, respecting the church to which Victoria had belonged, while Laurier and other ministers attended services of their own communion. Still, this minor dispute did not affect the mark left on Canada by Victoria's long and popular reign, which resulted in many places being named in her honour and monuments to her, such as statues on Parliament Hill and throughout the provinces. The Queen's reign was permanently memorialised in Canada when, in the spring of 1901, it was decided by Parliament that the 24th of May would continue as a holiday marking the late Queen's birthday, named as Victoria Day, to distinguish it from the King's birthday celebration to be held in November.